Good Friday morning, everybody. Welcome into your FreightWaves Now Community Spotlight on this fabulous Friday. It is time for the coolest community in freight running on ice, and we've got the coolest lady that is part of our editorial team, Mary O'Connell, here to chit-chat with us. Mary, another good episode on the way today, this time talking some cross-border logistics with Redwood, Mexico.
Yeah, so we've talked about domestic cold chain for a little bit, but obviously the rise of nearshoring and everything like that, it's really taken off. So with we just kind of took a step to learn about kind of how cross-border produce works in Mexico and kind of the implications that have come with the rise of nearshoring on the dry van side and how it's led to just a touch of congestion at some of the border crossings that have made it less than fun to navigate for some of those suppliers.
Yeah, obviously, when it comes to produce movements and cold chain movements that are cross-border, we see a lot of that in the produce space because for the United States, we import so much, not just from Mexico, but from Central and Southern America. And a lot of that comes maybe on a boat if you're coming from South America, but lands in Mexico and then gets trucked across the border because it ends up being cheaper. And we see, as you mentioned, that rise of nearshoring, the influx of dry van traffic. It's led to a lot of headaches in some of these border crossings that haven't quite been expanded to accommodate the massive increase in traffic that is heading cross-border. And Redwood, of course, is one of those groups that is based in the United States but has these satellite offices. What are they doing to kind of work around some of this congestion, and what are they seeing as far as numbers go of traffic?
So they've really kind of set some of their shippers and their suppliers up for success. Something I didn't know until we started talking to Jordan Dewart today was that some of the Mexican farmers have adjusted their growing seasons for certain major food events here in the U.S., if you will. So they have a huge avocado harvest at the end of January, beginning of February for Super Bowl season. And so that's one of the things that they've kind of done to work with and accommodate some of the demand that we have here in the U.S. for certain produce year round. So that way we're not just stuck with a bunch of root vegetables and oranges in the wintertime. So that being said, there is that congestion at the border, but they have really kind of seen the rise of those customs warehouses where it's a cold chain warehouse that also has a customs brokerage facility on site. And thankfully, the Customs and Border Patrol agents and the organization as a whole has really seen the importance of prioritizing produce and some of those temperature sensitive goods because as we well know, my tried and true example of a pair of jeans can wait in line for 2 hours and still be a pair of jeans. But some of your produce, if it sits for 2 hours outside of its temperature range, then it's not going to still be a piece of produce. It's going to waste a little bit. And that's not something that we need at all. So the trickiest part is definitely from the U.S. into Mexico, from Mexico into the U.S., as that is where some of the more congestion is happening, getting back into the U.S. from there.
One of the really creative solutions that we've seen, and I've spoken to Noy Mahoney about this, who's of course our Borderlands writer, is that a lot of these companies will establish offices that are quite literally just across the border from each other. So you'll have an office that is technically Mexican located on the Mexico side of the border, but another identical office that is just on the U.S. side of the border, thinking in towns like Laredo, which is a massive, massive freight hub and border entry point, or El Paso, again, which is another giant border entry point. Can we talk about the strategy a little bit and how that specifically works for folks in the cold chain space? You mentioned those kind of co-located warehouses and customs brokerage sites, but do we see them being duplicated on either side of the border?
Oh, absolutely. And that's because how things work with the Mexican border is infinitely different than how they work with the US-Canada border. So for Canada, you can basically, if you're taking a load from Ontario to upstate New York or something like that, that driver can drive it the whole time. They can go from Ontario all the way through to New York, and then get a load to go back. Whereas with the shipments that happen down in Mexico, that's not really the case. That Mexican driver is not, if you're going from Mexico into the US, that Mexican driver is not completing that move. They are not going more than a couple miles from the border. They're crossing it either They're crossing it and either giving it to another carrier to take it the rest of the way, or they're dropping it off at a warehouse and then that truck is going back to Mexico and then a US carrier will complete the rest of that leg. And the same thing happens on the Mexican side. I'm not entirely sure why that happens. I know there's probably a reason for it. I'm just not that versed in cross-border. I'm not that well versed in cross-border logistics. But there is absolutely going to be those warehouses that mimic each other on both sides of the border for that reason. So that way it kind of it's that way to maintain control and visibility. Because unfortunately a lot of times it's less so now, but historically Mexico has always been referred to as kind of a black hole, if you will, where stuff goes in and you just really kind of hope that it makes it there.
One of the other things that is really interesting when it comes to influencing cross-border freight is differences in exchange rates and the fluctuations that we see there. That's one of the topics that you guys talk about today. But if we go back to your US to Mexico versus US to Canada example, the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Canadian dollar is honestly pretty stable. We don't see a ton of fluctuation there, but we do see a lot of fluctuation in the differences between the US dollar and the peso. Can you talk a little bit about how that influences strategy when it comes to maybe carriers who are looking to run cross-border freight, or even suppliers who are in the United States, or folks who are in the United States looking to source from Mexican growers?
Yeah, so it really kind of depends. Since there is no set standard, typically when you have a US to Canada shipment, it will the I think I'm pretty sure it's this way that whatever country it ends in is the currency it ends up getting paid in. But like you said, it's pretty even. But when it comes to the peso, it could be the difference between a driver making a lot of money on a load or, not necessarily coming out profitable. So when the peso increases and is strong against the dollar, it's going to be a little harder for those carriers to be a little more profitable, because there is something to be said for making money and saving money as a shipper, but also earning more money as a carrier or customs brokerage when the peso is weak against the dollar, because you get that extra bump in conversion. It's definitely something to watch out for, and it could potentially get some shippers or carriers in trouble if they're not clear about what the dollar amount and what currency they're talking about in, just because you don't want to say I'm going to pay you $600, but you really meant pesos instead of American dollars, because that's completely different. So it's really just kind of a kink that everybody is working through to just kind of make sure that everybody is on the up and up and has that visibility as to what currency they're going to use.
The other big issue that we've seen having a really massive impact on border crossings, and this absolutely has a massive impact on our cold chain stuff that moves across the border, is an increase in inspections and inspection wait time. You mentioned that metaphor, jeans versus your produce, right? But when it comes down to it, a lot of the issues have been on the United States side with these increased inspections and really long wait times, sometimes even shutting down border crossings altogether. Any insights on what folks need to be prepared for when they're looking at moving cross-border freight, ways to protect their temperature-controlled goods, or just a lookout to say, hey, you know what, maybe the Laredo crossing is closed for like 5 days, we should find an alternate solution?
Yeah, so definitely keep a track of the wait times. I believe the Customs and Border Patrol has live wait times on their website, as well as any anticipated closures or other things like that. But I would definitely say when it comes to border crossings, pack your patient pants and make sure that your reefer unit is full up on diesel or fully charged, however you're running that. Whether it's diesel or electric. But the good thing is that the Customs and Border Patrol agents are kind of prioritizing temperature sensitive and produce, because they do understand that it can spoil, and that there is talk someday maybe of there being kind of like a produce fast pass. But that's also been the rise. That's also why we've seen the rise in those Customs and Border inspections happening at a warehouse level. So that way they kind of get that like sign off of okay, and that way the Border Patrol agents at the border know that it's the hard part's already been done. Just kind of give a cursory inspection and then move it along. So there is improvements, but there is still a very long way to go to make it as efficient as the U.S. to Canada crossings.
There we go. All right, Mary, thank you for joining us this morning for your community update. Of course, we will catch Running on Ice later on this afternoon right here on FreightWaves TV. Have a great weekend, and we will catch up with you next week.
Bye, guys. See you next week.